My name is Stuart Akers, and I was born in 1948 on May the 13th. By the time 1950 came, I was a couple of years old. I was born in Peebles. I'm a homegrown gutter blood. I was born in Peebles in the nursing home, the maternity part of the nursing home in that year, 48. As people will know now, the things were badly damaged down there by this so-called Storm Frank. That's right, ridiculous names for these disastrous hurricanes. And this one, so people I think can envisage where it is, and it used to have a maternity. It's a bit like Kingsmeadows House. It used to be a maternity ward during the war, and then it was transferred back to the nursing home, and that's where my birth took place, and that of my brother in 1952, roughly around about then. He was born, and so that's the maternity was at the left, I believe. Yes, the very first one closest to the gates of the church, Lecky Church, and that was where maternity was. And I think we also have the information on my father, who had to take the bus to work at the old Peel Hospital, which, incidentally, was only regarded as a wartime hospital and would close immediately the war ended, which did not happen. My father always used to say, "I'm fed up waiting for this new hospital to be built." But I'm afraid he had to retire on health grounds in 78, and the hospital wasn't built for at least another decade, I believe, so he never saw it. He never saw it in the days of his work. And but he would get the bus to there was a bus shelter opposite Peel Hospital, and he would get the bus to there. This shelter is fairly close to the village hall of Yare. No, Caddenfoot. My apologies, Caddenfoot. And so he would get off the bus there and walk up to the hospital. That was the way of things before they used a minibus to get members of staff up there. And when I was 4, I had my tonsils removed, as I've said but this was also the nursing home. It actually functioned as a hospital, quite literally. It was a genuine hospital at the time, and I had my tonsils removed there, and that was in the middle part, I think, the middle part of the nursing home. And I always remember the great flood of 1953, which flooded Tweed Green. There's never been quite anything like that. The whole of Tweed Green had to be evacuated during that, and the waters were lapping the foot of Tweed Brae, which is where the former baths were, which is now the Evangelical Church. And even before that time, long before that time, that's where the Reverend Lecky set up his church in that same area. So it's quite historical, and the waters in the 1953 flood were lapping the foot of Tweed Brae at a place which was known as the Gault Foot, the Gault Fit, which in more ancient times. My first 4 years of life were spent in Elco Street, number 9. And then thereafter we moved to Glensacks Road, which was a newly built housing scheme when I was 4 to 5. When I was 4, my tonsils were removed. I'm not sure whether that was a good thing or not, but it happened. And the last thing I remember before I was put under was this terrible thing coming down onto my face, which was the anaesthetizer. Yeah. But I was slightly comforted by the fact that Dr. Robin Wilson's face was behind it, and he is a doctor in whom I reposed great confidence. I was crazy. So there we are. That was the tonsils, and then the move to Glensacks Road. And it was a small family we had, and one of the siblings was my brother, who was 6 years junior to me. I wasn't very keen on his advent. I told my mother I would rather have had a dog. And my first view of my little brother was he was kicking in his cot in the nursing home, looking for all the world like an upturned beetle. And that was my only sibling, and we've had a good relationship all our lives, him and me. Once I got used to him, once I accepted him. And I went to school at Halerud School, and at one time it was just round the corner from where I was spent the first 4 years of my life. But I had to come from Glensacks Road to go to school, and I always remember coming into the school. Children did not have anything preparatory to make them feel at home. Believe you me, it was quite primitive. And the first thing I saw was a blackboard full of ones, as in 1, 2, 3. And that was the way we were taught our numbers, and also I think our letters too, if I remember rightly. But that's the first thing I saw, this blackboard full of ones. And the severe Miss Kerr took us. She was a good teacher. She was the headmistress then. I think she had succeeded Mrs. Benong. And Miss Kerr was, she was all right. She got the education over to us, but she was a trifle severe. So, I had a rather unfortunate time a little later when I contracted a form of dysentery after eating duck eggs. I will not go into the gory details of that, but it was just one of the things that happened to us. And school, I was never a happy bunny at school, neither then nor in Kingsland, where we went to when we were 7 years old. And I was never terribly happy. My strong subjects were English and history. Hopeless at maths, hopeless. Anyway, yeah. I failed my 11 plus, and I was glad years later to discover that iniquitous system had disappeared. They got rid of it. And so I was happy about it. It was too late for me, but my life has gone okay anyway. Don't worry, it's not a big issue, not a huge issue. And the holidays, we spent holidays at home. With my family, our only first real holiday was to Oban, and that was 1960. So that's a bit later than this chronicle. And but we had days out when we went on the train to Edinburgh for the zoo. It was really practically the only reason we went was to go to the zoo. So it was very enjoyable, that, always. And going on the trains, I had a good experience of the trains during the 50s, mainly in the middle to late 50s. The trains were still running. Yes, but there was enough to keep us occupied, certainly keep me occupied. With regard to shops, in those days, you had greengrocers and food shops all over the high street. This was long before the advent of tourism. Peebles was still an industrial town dominated by the mills, although that wasn't to last too much longer. So, and the Peebles was functional, you could say. The shops were mainly food shops, as I've said, butchers, greengrocers, grocers, and everything else like that. And there were toy shops as well. And I think there's maybe one bookshop, if I remember, but it was mainly toy shops. And in those days, I was very fond of medieval knights. And the toys in those days were metal. That's what I loved. I love anything that's heavyish. To me, it smacks of good quality. It may not be, but it smacks of good quality. And the metal knights in those days were marvellous. And it was one of my great loves, was to play with metal knights, especially after the film King Arthur came out in 1953, which I forget who played King Arthur, but Stanley Baker played Mordred, and Robert Taylor was Sir Lancelot. Perhaps some people will recall that. And I absolutely loved that film, absolutely loved it. That's what first developed in me a craze for a King Arthur and the Arthurian tradition. And but what else? The main thing is that after this film really was all the rage, totally, for children and adults. And we watched it in the Playhouse in the High Street. There were 2 cinemas then, the Playhouse and the Empire Cinema, which had been built earlier. And it was in the Brigate. And people of Peebles developed the annoying habit of calling the Brigate Empire Bray, which annoyed the blazes out of me. Especially later on, when the onset of adulthood, I became much more critical. And so we have that. We have this film, which was all over this country being played, but in its wake, they developed a whole series of metal toys, knights in armour. And sometimes there was detachable swords and everything like that. And I was delighted. I just played. I played them to death, when I was a kid during the 50s. But my favourite actually was not of the King Arthur film. My favourite was a metal knight, which is incidentally in the Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh. Not the same one as I had, but exactly the same model. But the one I have was played to death, of course. And it is a metal knight with a detachable helmet. The knight could come off his horse, detachable sword, detachable battle axe, and detachable lance. He was a marvellous fellow. And I invented all sorts of stories round this chap. And I got him I was walking along the street and looked in the window of Easton's, which used to stand where there was an outdoor clothes shop. It used to stand beside the old the Trustee Savings Bank. That's right. And on the other side was the Bank of Scotland. And Easton's was there, and I saw the knight in the window, and it was 2 and 6pence. And I'm not sure whether I had a half-crown with me or not, but I might have had. I went in and bought it straight away. Oh, marvellous. And that was a long saga. That was regarding toys. I was also keen on model railways, and I did have a Hornby's train set as well, which was got in Tommy Baker's, which some people will remember. It is down the Northgate. And old Tommy Baker had all sorts of things. He also, for a while, had LP records, but that was later. And that's so I enjoyed train sets, but there was nothing quite like the toy knights, the metal knights. I must always insist on this, metal. When they came out later in plastic, I detested that. I regarded them as cheap rubbish, and there was only one thing: metal knights, or metal soldiers even. But that's how a lot of us occupied ourselves. And when I think of other things, I would sometimes, by this time I was at Kingsland, about 7 years old, maybe 8 years old, 7 to 8 years old, in lunchtime, I would be bold enough, perhaps in the company of another classmate, to go down to the site of the old Caledonian station. And people will remember that trains used to use that. It was right. You could get to Glasgow very quickly on the old Caledonian station. John Buchan and his siblings and his grandchildren, they loved that. The whole Buchan family loved the Caledonian Railway. It was known as the LMS, I think, later, before it closed up. But I didn't have the good fortune to travel on the train. It was gone by that time, but I enjoyed coming down at lunchtime from the school to play in the derelict Caledonian station. And that was one of my little pursuits. It was my love of history, I suppose, that was stimulated by playing in this place. And other things too. I began to get more fond of old places, old houses, and all that. But that again was later. So what we have. I think I said that we went to the zoo. That's right, on the railway. That's right. Yeah, that was a big highlight. Can't even quite remember how often we did this. It could have been once a month. Something like that, but these little particulars are a bit hazy. And yes, I didn't, with regard to events in the town, I didn't have a terribly happy relationship with the Beltane Festival in Peebles, and I was always unwell. Isn't that strange? I was always unwell. I was a dwarf on one occasion. Yeah, this would be the late 50s, maybe middle to late 50s, maybe. Yeah, I was a dwarf, and I was really unwell. And dear me, my father rescued me. This great hero plucked me off the lorry because he could see that I wasn't great. So I was rescued in that sense. So I never had a great enthusiasm for the Beltane Festival. And later on, when I was older, I sort of, I was a bit, that was a bit petty of me, but I did actually begin to call it the pseudo Beltane Festival. But that was a bit petty, you could say. Because I had a bit of a soured experience with it. But there were some days when the sun was out and it was beautiful, standing in front of the parish church and watching the proceedings. You know, there were good days as well as bad days. And I think I have talked about the cinema and the cinemas. And once or twice, yes, I did go to the Empire Cinema in the Brigade, and I can't remember what I watched there. Was it Superman or some kind of predecessor of Superman? But I do remember that. But the Playhouse was my favourite cinema. It was the one I liked best. And the Playhouse lasted longer than the Empire Cinema. It closed down. But going slightly back to the railways, I did travel, as I say, on the North British Railway, which assumed another name before 1960. And some people will remember the railway used to pass under a bridge called the Sand Bridge. And the Sand Bridge is so called because of the nature of the soil round about. And people nowadays will hardly recognise. You know, they'll if the Sand Bridge suddenly reappeared, they wouldn't know where they were. But it's the bit at the junction of March Street and Edinburgh Road, and there's a big flower arrangement up on the bridge as you turn right or left. But in those days, when the Sand Bridge was filled up that gap, the cars couldn't get onto the Edinburgh Road. There was a big flight of steps up the Sand Bridge. And again, you know, people now might find it difficult to believe this. And just to the left, there was not the Brown Brothers showroom as it is now, but there was the old mission hut, which at one time had the very curious name of Saint Tin, because it was made of that, you see. And it had a long history, the old mission hut. and latterly the Ferguson brothers ran it as part of their mission. And my mother and aunt, both of whom are now deceased, of course, they both attended it as girls. So it goes back a long, long way in the lives of people. And so that was just an area which, it's completely changed. And as the mills disappeared one by one, this also happened. But this was later. The mills were in their full strength during the 50s decade. And even the mill by the Tweed had not burned down at that time. That was 63. But it was still there, and the chimneys were all over the place. And occasionally, the workers in the mills, one of whom was a grandfather of mine, my mother's father, and my Aunt Alice worked there also. And every now and then, during the middle of the day, they got their hour off, or was it half an hour off? I'm not totally sure. And the mill bellowed out. It had a horn, boo, this kind of thing, And, you'd always say, oh, yes, it's summoning the serfs back to work. And I always thought like that, Even when I was young, I thought, oh, they're being summoned. They're being summoned back to work. They've only had their hour or half hour of lunch break, and then back they went, all crowding up. When I was very young, early 50s, I actually always saw whole crowds of people going from Elco Street, that whole conurbation, Cross Street, and all that area. They were all going in the same direction after lunch, and in the morning, and in the early morning. They were all going in the same direction. And when I was little, I actually thought, I think I asked my mother, is heaven up that way? And I'm sure I did, I was quite absolutely positive that heaven lay in that direction. But I was only about 4-year-old, that sort of thing. And I was soon disabused of that, let us say, childish conviction. I think I've mentioned this already about the post office, that where the postmen used to get their vans started on the brae. And one of my old colleagues, a great birdman, used to say that on the cuddy at that area, kingfishers were up and down all the time. I should say that, definitely. It was a haunt of kingfishers. They're now vastly outnumbered by the ducks. Far too many ducks down there now. And, and people don't do them any good by feeding them bread. And I thought I'd put that in. But definitely, it was Kingfisher Alley down there in those old days, say the 50s, the 40s, 30s, even going back that far. And I think so we have that area full of life on the steep decline of Usher's Wynd. And the usher in question was a councillor, not so much a councillor. There's another name for them, but he was a very prominent man called John Usher, and this was the 15th century. So that gives you an idea how old Usher's Wynd is. And at the top there was a house there was a well known as Usher's Well, and I believe that is the origin of the wife, that ancient anonymous poem, The Wife of Usher's Well. Robert Chambers disagrees. I don't care. I believe that was the case.